The Emperor of All Maladies, by Siddhartha Mukherjee. Introduction. Imagine waking up one morning with a strange numbness in your head. Not a normal headache, but the kind of deep, unsettling feeling that instantly tells you something is terribly wrong. For Carla Reed, a 30-year-old kindergarten teacher and mother of 3, this was her reality in May of 2004. For weeks, mysterious bruises had appeared on her back like strange maps, then vanished. Her gums turned white. A woman used to chasing 5-year-olds all day suddenly found herself so exhausted she had to crawl on all fours just to get from one room to another. Doctors were stumped. They suggested migraines, maybe aspirin. But the aspirin only made her gums bleed more. Finally, after demanding blood tests, she received a call the next morning at a fish market. The nurse's voice on the phone was urgent. "Come now," she said. "Come now." What followed was a diagnosis that would shatter her world: leukemia. A cancer of the blood, in one of its most violent forms. Carla was told her chances of being cured were about 30%. A little less than 1 in 3. What is this terrifying, shape-shifting disease that we call cancer? Where did it come from? And why has it become the defining plague of our generation? For thousands of years, it has been humanity's most intimate and relentless adversary, an enemy that seems to arise from within our own bodies. Today, we're diving into a book that isn't just a history of this disease, but its biography. The Emperor of All Maladies by Siddhartha Mukherjee, an oncologist and Pulitzer Prize-winning author, is one of the most important books ever written about medicine. It tells the epic, 4,000-year story of our war against cancer, a story filled with heroes and hubris, breathtaking victories and devastating defeats. By the end of our journey today, you will understand this Emperor of All Maladies not as some abstract medical term, but as a character in our collective human story. You'll learn how a series of accidental discoveries, brilliant insights, and heartbreaking failures have brought us to where we are today, on the verge of a new understanding, a new way of fighting. This isn't just a story about science, it's a story about human resilience, about our deepest fears, and our most profound hopes. Book summary. Our story begins not in a modern hospital, but thousands of years ago, in ancient Egypt, around 2500 BC. In a crumbling papyrus, a physician named Imhotep described 48 medical cases. He wrote about broken bones and abscesses with a surprisingly modern, scientific clarity. But case 45 was different. He described a bulging mass in the breast, cool, hard, and spreading under the skin. It's one of the most vivid descriptions of breast cancer ever recorded. But when it came to the section on treatment, Imhotep wrote just 3 words: there is none. For millennia, that was humanity's relationship with cancer. It was a silent, mysterious, and unbeatable foe. The ancient Greeks gave it a name, karkinos, the Greek word for crab, because the swollen blood vessels around a tumor reminded them of a crab digging into the sand. Another word they used was onkos, meaning a mass, a load, or a burden. From this, we get our modern word, oncology. But what caused this burden? The great Greek physician Galen, around 160 AD, proposed a theory that would dominate medicine for over 1,500 years. He believed the human body was governed by 4 fluids, or humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. Illness, he said, was an imbalance of these humors. And cancer? Cancer was caused by an excess of the most malevolent humor of all, black bile. This wasn't just some strange, ancient idea. It had a profound impact. If cancer was caused by a fluid that flowed throughout the entire body, then cutting out a single tumor was pointless. The black bile would just flow right back. For centuries, surgery for cancer was seen as a fool's errand. Instead, doctors tried to purge the black bile with bizarre remedies: lead tinctures, fox lungs, goat dung, and even blessed water. This dark age of understanding only began to lift in the 1500s, with a young anatomist from Brussels named Andreas Vesalius. Vesalius was obsessed with seeing the human body for himself. He scoured graveyards and gibbets for bodies to dissect, creating the first truly accurate maps of human anatomy. But as he meticulously drew every vein and organ, he noticed something was missing. He could find blood, he could find phlegm, he could find yellow bile in the liver. But no matter where he looked, he could not find Galen's glistening, oily black bile. It simply wasn't there. Vesalius quietly buried the black bile theory, and with it, the idea that cancer was an untreatable, systemic disease. If cancer was a local problem, just a tumor, then perhaps it could be solved with a local solution. The door was opened for a new kind of warrior in the fight against cancer, the surgeon. But surgery in the 18th and early 19th centuries was a brutal, terrifying affair. Without anesthesia, patients were strapped down, often drunk on opium or alcohol, while surgeons worked at breakneck speed. Worse still was the threat of infection. A simple cut could quickly turn into a fatal, gangrenous wound. Everything changed in a brief span between 1846 and 1867. First came anesthesia, publicly demonstrated at Massachusetts General Hospital, allowing surgeons to perform long, complex operations without inflicting unbearable pain. Then, a Scottish surgeon named Joseph Lister, inspired by Louis Pasteur's work on germs, realized that infections were caused by invisible microorganisms. He began cleaning wounds with carbolic acid, an antiseptic, and post-surgical death rates plummeted. With these twin breakthroughs, anesthesia and antisepsis, a new, incandescent century of cancer surgery began. Surgeons, once timid, became bold, attacking tumors in the stomach, colon, ovaries, and breast. And no surgeon was bolder, more meticulous, or more influential than William Stewart Halsted. Halsted, a brilliant and obsessive surgeon at Johns Hopkins in the 1890s, believed that to cure cancer, you had to be more aggressive than the disease itself. He developed a procedure for breast cancer called the radical mastectomy. It wasn't just about removing the tumor. Halsted removed the entire breast, the chest muscles underneath it, and the lymph nodes in the armpit, sometimes even slicing through the collarbone. He called it radical from the Latin word for root, believing he was uprooting cancer from its very source. The operations were disfiguring. Women were left with caved-in chests, swollen arms, and permanent pain. But Halsted and his followers believed this was a necessary war wound. The mantra became, "Cut more to cure more." But did it work? After decades of data, a troubling picture emerged. While the massive surgeries did reduce the chances of cancer returning locally, they didn't significantly improve overall survival. Nearly half of Halsted's patients still died within 3 years, consumed by a disease that had supposedly been uprooted. The problem was a deep flaw in Halsted's logic. Cancer, it turned out, wasn't always a local disease that spread in an orderly, centrifugal way. Sometimes, even from a tiny tumor, cancer cells could break away and travel to distant organs like the lungs or liver, a process called metastasis. For these patients, a radical mastectomy was too little, too late. For patients whose cancer was truly local, a much smaller, less disfiguring surgery would have been just as effective. It was too much, too early. Halsted's radical mastectomy, a procedure performed on hundreds of thousands of women for nearly a century, was based on a flawed understanding of the enemy. The war against cancer couldn't be won with the knife alone. A new kind of weapon was needed, one that could hunt down cancer cells wherever they hid in the body. The era of systemic therapy was about to begin. The birth of this new era came from a completely unexpected place, the chemical dye industry in 19th century Germany. As textile factories boomed, chemists raced to create new synthetic dyes from scratch. A young medical student named Paul Ehrlich began using these dyes to stain cells under a microscope. He was astonished to find that different dyes stained different parts of cells, and some even stained specific bacteria while leaving human cells untouched. This sparked a revolutionary idea in Ehrlich's mind. If a chemical could specifically target and stain a microbe, couldn't another chemical be designed to specifically target and kill it, without harming the patient? He called this idea chemotherapy, and his visionary drugs he called magic bullets. In 1910, he discovered his first blockbuster, Compound 606, a drug that cured the dreaded disease syphilis. Ehrlich dreamed of finding a magic bullet for cancer, but he ran into a fundamental problem. Bacteria are foreign invaders, radically different from human cells. But a cancer cell? A cancer cell is a distorted version of our normal selves. Finding a poison that could kill cancer without killing the patient seemed almost impossible. The first true anti-cancer chemical didn't come from a deliberate search for a magic bullet, but from a weapon of war. During World War I, German forces unleashed a blistering agent called mustard gas. Years later, pathologists studying soldiers who had survived the gas attacks found something strange. Their bone marrows were scorched and depleted, their white blood cell counts had plummeted. This grotesque observation sparked an idea in the minds of two pharmacologists at Yale, Louis Goodman and Alfred Gilman. Leukemia is a cancer of white blood cells. If mustard gas could decimate normal white blood cells, could a controlled, intravenous version of it be used to kill malignant white cells? In 1942, they treated a man with lymphoma with a derivative of mustard gas. The results were miraculous, but temporary. The swollen glands would melt away, only to return a few months later. The stage was set for the man who would become the father of modern chemotherapy, Sidney Farber. In a small, damp basement lab at Boston's Children's Hospital in 1947, Farber, a pathologist tired of studying the dead, decided to try to treat the living. His focus was childhood leukemia, one of the most hopeless of all cancers. He reasoned that leukemia, a liquid cancer floating in the blood, was measurable. He could count the cancer cells, administer a chemical, and see if the numbers went down. Farber was fascinated by the work of a physician named Lucy Wills, who had discovered that a vitamin-like substance called folic acid was essential for the production of blood cells. He wondered if giving folic acid to children with leukemia might restore normalcy to their blood. It was a horrific mistake. The folic acid didn't stop the cancer, it accelerated it, causing the leukemia cells to explode. But Farber, in that disaster, saw an opportunity. If folic acid fed the leukemia, what if he could use a chemical that blocked it, an antifolate? He obtained a vial of a yellow chemical called aminopterin from a chemist friend, Yella Pragata Subara. In December 1947, he began treating children with acute leukemia. One of his first patients was a 2-year-old boy named Robert Sandler. The response was breathtaking. The boy's astronomical white blood cell count suddenly stopped rising, then began to drop. His enlarged spleen shrank. He began to walk again. For a brief, magical month, Robert seemed normal. It was the first time a chemical had ever induced a remission in leukemia. But the remissions were always temporary. The cancer would inevitably return, more aggressive than before. Robert Sandler died in 1948. Farber had opened a door, glimpsed an incandescent possibility, and then watched it slam shut. But that glimpse was enough. He became convinced that cancer could be cured by chemicals. What he needed was not just more drugs, but a national crusade. To launch this crusade, Farber found an unlikely and powerful ally, Mary Lasker. A wealthy, politically savvy Manhattan socialite and businesswoman, Lasker had declared a personal war on disease after her mother's death from a stroke. "I am opposed to heart attacks and cancer," she once said, "the way one is opposed to sin." Lasker was a force of nature. Using her husband's advertising principle of salesmanship in print, she believed that medical research needed to be marketed to the American public like a product. She transformed the sleepy American Society for the Control of Cancer into a high-powered lobbying and fundraising machine, the American Cancer Society. Farber and Lasker were a perfect match, the scientific visionary and the political powerhouse. Farber needed a lobbyist, Lasker needed a doctor to legitimize her spin doctors. Together, they began to dream of a war on cancer. To build public support, Farber created a powerful symbol. He found a young boy with lymphoma, Einar Gustafsson, a baseball fan from Maine. Rechristened Jimmy, the boy was featured on a national radio show in 1948, where players from the Boston Braves surprised him in his hospital room. The public response was staggering. The Jimmy Fund was born, and it became one of the most successful cancer advocacy organizations in history. Farber had learned a crucial lesson. The fight against cancer needed mascots, slogans, and advertising as much as it needed science. By the 1950s, the chemical arsenal was growing. At Burroughs Wellcome, two researchers, George Hitchings and Gertrude Elion, synthesized a molecule called 6-mercaptopurine, or 6-MP, which also produced temporary remissions in leukemia. The pieces were falling into place for a full-scale assault. In 1955, at the National Cancer Institute (NCI) in Bethesda, two young doctors, Emil Frey and Emil Frey-Rieck, decided to take a radical step. They had seen that single drugs only produced temporary remissions before the cancer grew resistant. They were inspired by the treatment for tuberculosis, where doctors used a blitzkrieg of multiple antibiotics at once to overwhelm the bacteria. What if they could do the same for leukemia? The idea of treating children with a cocktail of 2, 3, or even 4 highly toxic drugs was considered insane, cruel, and reckless. The leukemia ward at the NCI was already being called a butcher shop, but Frey and Frey-Rieck persisted. They devised a 4-drug combination they called VAMP, vincristine, amitriptyline, mercaptopurine, and prednisone. The first children treated were pushed to the absolute brink of death. The chemo raged through their bodies, wiping out all their normal cells. But then, something incredible happened. As the children recovered, their bone marrow biopsies came back clean. The leukemia had vanished. These were remissions so deep, so profound, that they exceeded everyone's wildest expectations. But then came the devastating setback. One by one, the children in remission returned to the clinic with headaches and seizures. The leukemia, while wiped out from their blood, had found a sanctuary in the brain, a place the chemotherapy drugs couldn't reach. The cancer had explosively relapsed. It seemed like the end of the road. But in Memphis, Tennessee, at a new hospital called St. Jude's, an oncologist named Donald Pinkel decided to push the logic even further. He devised a regimen he called total therapy. It involved not just a combination of drugs, but a combination of combinations. He added radiation directly to the skull to kill the cancer cells hiding in the brain, and he continued chemotherapy not for months, but for 2 to 3 years, long after every visible sign of the disease had vanished. It was a brutal, punishing regimen, total hell, as fellows called it. But it worked. By 1979, Pinkel's team announced that they could cure about 80% of children with acute lymphoblastic leukemia. A disease that was once a death sentence had become curable. The success against childhood leukemia, and a similar victory against Hodgkin's lymphoma using a 4-drug cocktail called MOP, ignited the political fire. For Farber and Lasker, this was the proof they needed. They lobbied relentlessly for a national, goal-driven effort to conquer cancer, analogous to the Apollo program that had put a man on the moon. "We are so close to a cure for cancer," Farber declared. "We lack only the will and the kind of money." On December 23, 1971, President Richard Nixon signed the National Cancer Act, officially declaring a war on cancer and pouring an unprecedented $1.5 billion into research. The Army was on the march. But the war would prove far more complex than anyone imagined. One of the great blind spots of this era was prevention. The war was almost entirely focused on finding a cure, while neglecting to ask what caused cancer in the first place. This was a strange amnesia, because the first major victory against cancer had been a victory of prevention. Back in 1775, a London surgeon named Percival Pott noticed that scrotal cancer occurred almost exclusively in one group of people: young chimney sweeps. He made the brilliant connection that chronic exposure to soot was the cause. It was the first time an environmental carcinogen had been identified. By regulating child labor and improving hygiene for sweeps, the man-made epidemic of scrotal cancer vanished. But in the 20th century, another, far deadlier man-made epidemic was brewing, and it was hiding in plain sight. In the 1940s, lung cancer rates were skyrocketing. Doctors and scientists blamed everything from road tar to industrial pollution. The real culprit, cigarette smoking, had become so common, nearly 9 out of 10 men smoked, that it was statistically invisible. As one epidemiologist put it, asking about a link between smoking and cancer was like asking about a link between sitting and cancer. It took two pairs of young, outsider researchers, Richard Dahl and Bradford Hill in London, and Ernst Winder and Everts Graham in St. Louis, to finally prove the connection. Their studies in the 1950s were masterpieces of epidemiology. They compared thousands of lung cancer patients to healthy controls and found an undeniable, powerful statistical link to smoking. To clinch the case, Dahl and Hill launched a prospective study, tracking the health of 40,000 British doctors over decades. The results were irrefutable. Smokers were dying of lung cancer at a vastly higher rate than non-smokers. The tobacco industry, of course, fought back with a brilliant and cynical campaign of misinformation. Their strategy was simple: doubt is our product. They funded their own research to create confusion, questioned the validity of the statistics, and insisted that correlation was not causation. It took another 3 decades of relentless legal and political battles, waged by activists, lawyers, and public health officials, to finally begin to turn the tide. The Surgeon General's report of 1964 officially declared smoking a cause of cancer. Warning labels were mandated on cigarette packs. And in a landmark case, a woman named Rose Cipollone, who died of lung cancer after smoking for decades, sued the tobacco companies from her grave, leading to the release of internal documents that exposed the industry's decades-long deception. The long battle against tobacco showed that prevention could work. But it also revealed the limits of epidemiology. You had to know what to look for. What was the fundamental mechanism that allowed so many different things, soot, tobacco, radiation, even viruses, to cause cancer? The answer would come from cracking the code of the cancer cell itself. For decades, cancer biology had been split between two warring theories. One camp believed cancer was caused by external agents, like viruses. The other believed it was an internal problem, caused by abnormalities in a cell's own chromosomes. The breakthrough that would finally unify these ideas came from studying the Rous sarcoma virus, a strange virus that caused cancer in chickens. In the 1970s, two virologists at UCSF, Michael Bishop and Harold Varmus, set out to find the cancer-causing gene in this virus, a gene called SRC. They expected to find a foreign, viral gene. But what they found was astonishing. A nearly identical version of the SRC gene already existed inside normal, healthy chicken cells. In fact, it existed in the cells of ducks, geese, mice, and even humans. This was a revelation. The cancer-causing gene was not a foreign invader. It was a distorted, mutated version of a normal gene that our own cells carry. They called these normal precursor genes proto-oncogenes. Cancer, they realized, wasn't caused by something foreign being put into our cells. It was caused by something already inside our cells breaking. A proto-oncogene is like a car's accelerator. In a normal cell, it's carefully regulated. But a mutation can jam the accelerator, leading to uncontrolled growth. Soon after, another class of cancer genes was discovered: tumor suppressor genes. If oncogenes are jammed accelerators, tumor suppressors are faulty brakes. A geneticist named Alfred Knudsen, studying a rare eye cancer in children called retinoblastoma, theorized that our cells have two copies of these brake genes. Cancer only occurs when both copies are inactivated by mutations, his two-hit hypothesis. At last, a unified theory of cancer was emerging. Cancer is a genetic disease. It arises from the accumulation of mutations in a critical handful of genes that control cell growth and division, oncogenes and tumor suppressors. This explained everything. It explained how radiation and chemicals cause cancer, by damaging DNA and causing mutations. It explained why cancer runs in some families. They inherit one hit in a tumor suppressor gene, making them more susceptible. Cancer, Varmus wrote, is a distorted version of our normal selves. This new, profound understanding of cancer's genetic roots opened the door for a completely new kind of therapy. Instead of using blunt poisons that kill all rapidly dividing cells, what if we could design smart drugs that specifically target the mutated oncogenes that drive a cancer's growth? The first proof of this principle came with a rare leukemia called CML. Scientists discovered that CML is caused by a single, specific oncogene called BCR-ABL, a hyperactive kinase that acts like a permanently switched-on signal for cell division. A young oncologist named Brian Drucker, collaborating with chemists at Ciba Geigy, found a molecule that could slip perfectly into the BCR-ABL protein and shut it off. The drug was named Gleevec. The results in clinical trials were stunning. In patients who had been given months to live, Gleevec produced complete remissions within weeks. A fatal leukemia was transformed into a manageable, chronic condition. It was the first time a drug had been rationally designed to switch off a cancer-causing gene. Roger Bannister had broken the 4-minute mile in athletics. Gleevec, it was said, was the 4-minute mile of oncology. Soon after, another targeted therapy, Herceptin, was developed for a particularly aggressive subtype of breast cancer driven by an oncogene called HER2. The era of targeted therapy had begun. But cancer, as always, fights back. Cancer cells, in their relentless cycle of mutation and selection, can evolve resistance to even the most targeted drugs. The oncogene itself can mutate, changing its shape so the drug no longer fits. This led to what's called the Red Queen's race, from Alice in Wonderland. We have to keep running, keep inventing new drugs, just to stay in the same place. Today, the treatment for many cancers is a sophisticated cat-and-mouse game, mixing and matching targeted drugs and traditional chemotherapy, switching strategies as the cancer evolves. We have not found a universal cure, and we likely never will. But the progress is undeniable. Since 1990, cancer mortality in the United States has declined by about 1% every year. That might sound modest, but its cumulative effect is remarkable. The decline is the result of a multi-pronged attack: prevention, through reduced smoking, screening, like pap smears and colonoscopies, and better treatments, from the brutal cocktails of the 60s to the smart drugs of today. No one, as one researcher put it, had labored in vain. The future of this war lies in knowing the enemy on an even deeper level. The Cancer Genome Atlas project is now sequencing the entire genomes of thousands of tumors, creating a complete map of all the mutations that drive different cancers. We are learning that every patient's cancer is unique. But beneath that overwhelming diversity, there is a deep unity. Most cancers, it turns out, have mutations in the same core set of about 13 signaling pathways. This is the new frontier. The challenge is no longer just to find poisons, but to find drugs that can intelligently target these broken pathways, to normalize the cancer cell, or at least to turn a fatal disease into a chronic, manageable one. The war is not over. But for the first time in our long history with this disease, we are beginning to fight on our own terms. We are learning its language, its strategy, its vulnerabilities. 4,000 years after Imhotep wrote, "There is none," we can finally begin to write a different ending. Commentary. When you finish a book like The Emperor of All Maladies, it's hard not to feel a sense of awe. Awe at the sheer scale of the story, the incredible persistence of the scientists and doctors who dedicated their lives to this fight, and the profound resilience of the patients who endured it all. For me, there are a few core lessons that really stand out. The first is the incredible, almost humbling, power of incremental progress. We love stories of sudden, dramatic breakthroughs, the eureka moment. But the story of cancer is a story of slow, painstaking, often brutal, step-by-step learning. Think about it. It took 1,500 years just to get over the idea of black bile. It took decades of failed surgeries before Halsted, for all his flaws, created a procedure that at least offered a glimmer of hope. It took Farber's horrific mistake with folic acid to lead to the first chemotherapy. Each generation built on the failures and small victories of the last. It's a powerful reminder that the biggest changes in the world often don't come from one giant leap, but from thousands of small, persistent steps. The second lesson is about the nature of science itself. This book is a beautiful illustration of how science is not a straight line. It's a messy human process, filled with ego, competition, serendipity, and, most important, the courage to be wrong. From Galen's black bile to Halsted's radical surgery to the early, overly optimistic theories about cancer viruses, the history of oncology is littered with ideas that were passionately believed and later proven to be flawed. But each flawed idea, when rigorously tested, pushed the field forward. It taught us something new. It shows that the goal of science isn't to be right all the time, but to get closer to the truth by being willing to question our most cherished beliefs. But the most profound lesson for me is about the very nature of cancer itself. The idea that cancer is a distorted version of our normal selves is one of the most haunting and powerful concepts in all of medicine. This isn't some foreign invader. It's us. It's our own genes, our own pathways for growth and survival, perverted and unleashed. Cancer is a flaw in our growth, but that flaw is deeply, inextricably linked to the very processes that allow us to live, to heal, and to regenerate. This understanding changes how we see the fight. It's not about finding a single magic bullet that will eradicate a foreign enemy. It's about a far more nuanced and difficult task, finding a way to control our own runaway biology, to distinguish the us from the distorted us. So, what can we take away from this epic story? First, a deep appreciation for the quiet, often uncelebrated work of scientists and doctors. The next time you hear about a new breakthrough, remember the decades of labor, the countless failures, and the intellectual courage that went into it. Second, a renewed focus on prevention. The single biggest victory in the war on cancer so far has been the decline in lung cancer deaths due to reduced smoking. It's a powerful reminder that some of the most effective battles are the ones we fight before the disease ever begins, by understanding and changing the behaviors that put us at risk. And finally, a sense of perspective. The war on cancer is not over, but we are no longer fighting in the dark. We have a map, even if it's incomplete. We have weapons that are getting smarter every year. The goal may not be to achieve immortality by eradicating death, but, as one epidemiologist put it, to ensure that death in old age is inevitable, but death before old age is not, by turning a fatal disease into a chronic, manageable one, by giving people years, even decades, of life back. That is a victory worth fighting for. That was a summary of The Emperor of All Maladies by Siddhartha Mukherjee. We've journeyed through the highlights today, but I'll be honest with you, a summary can only ever be a sketch of the real thing. The true power of this book is in the details, the human stories, the scientific detective work, and the beautiful, almost poetic way Mukherjee explains the most complex ideas. This summary is designed to give you a sense of whether this book is a journey you want to take. If anything we've talked about today has sparked your curiosity or touched you in some way, I encourage you to grab a copy. Reading it isn't just about learning facts, it's an experience that will fundamentally change how you think about medicine, science, and the human condition. A link to the book is in the description. Also, if you found this summary valuable and it gave you something to think about, please do me a small favor and hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. It lets me know that this kind of deep dive is what you're looking for, and it ensures you won't miss our next journey into another life-changing book from the billionaire's bookshelf. Let's keep learning and growing together.